Welcome to this webinar. There are two of us going to be doing presentations here today. I'm Chris Spray from University of Dundee, and my colleague here is Hugh Chalmers from Tweed Forum. You'll get a view of us in a minute, which gives you something to look at. This is the presentation for the Scottish catchment pilot. So Eddleston in Scotland is the pilot for work package 4, which looks at catchments in relation to building with nature. And the particular bit that we're going to be looking at is the whole area of stakeholder engagement and what we've learned from working for a number of years at Eddleston on stakeholder engagement as part of this project. Okay, Hugh, let's take it away. So there's the two of us. I'm the handsome young man on the left, and Hugh is the equally handsome young man on the other side there. Okay, next one. So this is what we're going to try and cover. We're going to start with the theory, step back a little bit and say, what is it we're trying to achieve with engaging with stakeholders? It's very much a sort of buzzword. People are always talking about it, but why bother? Why do it? And then what's the ideal engagement that you could do? And obviously the ideal and reality are two different things. So we'll then try and talk our way through the various steps along the way about defining who is important and who's not important in terms of stakeholders. And how do we talk to them? What do we talk to them about? And what do we gain from it? You know, what's the positives back to the project as well as the positives back to the different stakeholders? And Hugh's then going to give you the reality in his role as the coordinating person for all the connections with the landowners and the farmers in terms of the Eddleston work. I'm a scientist. I've been involved in coordinating the science. Hugh is very much the person with his feet on the ground, understanding exactly what farmers and landowners want and do. Okay, so with that, we'll kick off with the first bit then. Why? So why engage with stakeholders? Well, I guess it's an awkward word, and so who in heck's a stakeholder? But it's anyone with an interest in a river. And in our particular case, we're doing catchment restoration. So it's building with nature over a 70-kilometre square catchment. And it's really anyone who is impacted by a change in the quality or the quantity of the water coming down that river. And it could impact on their lives. And that might be a physical change to the water. It might be loss of some interesting species. It could be physical changes. It could be things that they just mentally feel and think about it. So it's current people who actually provide what we call ecosystem services. That's folk who might operate a dam or farmers who actually produce food for us. It's also the people who have access to those particular services, people who go walking, people who eat the food, people who use the trees that are grown there, or maybe also people who did once but no longer do, because of course a catchment isn't a single step in time. It's got a whole history of planting and different things. But we also get people who have an interest because they get disservices. So not all functions of a healthy catchment system are beneficial. You have floods, you have pollution. And you've also got services and stakeholders who enjoy things not actually in the catchment itself, but somewhere downstream. So as a great example, as a flood, it may not be the people actually within the catchment. It may be somewhere a long way downstream where the people get there. And then we have two other rather interesting ideas of stakeholders, which are really quite new. And one of them is, what about future generations? So instead of just thinking about the people we can talk to now, what about people 30 years down the line, people who haven't got a voice at present at all? And that's really quite an interesting challenge, and particularly if one's thinking sustainable development. And then the river itself. And if one was to go out of Scotland and down to India, to the Ganga, or to New Zealand, we now have scenarios where rivers have legal rights in their own, which is really quite an interesting concept. And with all of that, we've got questions of environmental justice and equitable sharing. So an awful lot of reasons, an awful lot of folk who might be stakeholders. Okay, Hugh? And one of the biggest challenges is that of connectivity. Now, John Muir, the person who was that quotation there, is one of Scotland's main exports to America, actually. He's a person who was responsible for the founding of some of the most important national parks in America. And what he said was, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And that's it, because we have to recognize that in our river, we have a huge complexity, a huge variety of things happening. And that when we talk about building with nature, it's not actually just about the river and its hydroecology. It's actually all about the society, it's about culture, it's about economic services. And quite often we find we're talking more to people and about their livelihoods and to communities than we actually are about the river. And the 8 photographs there just happened to be 8 photographs taken on one day as I walked down a river in India. And it shows you hydro dams, it shows you spiritual areas, it shows you fishing, it shows you irrigation, it shows sand mining, it shows biodiversity, it shows you discharges of untreated, highly polluted water, and it shows you farming. And that's all just in one little system. And that's all visual things you can see there. So connectivity is a real challenge when one starts talking with stakeholders, okay? And of course, the key thing about why engaging with stakeholders is that one needs to manage stakeholders' expectations at all times. The diagram there comes from the United Kingdom's National Ecosystem Assessment, and it gives you an idea about how we now look at a catchment. We look at all the things that go on there, the fact that there's farming, there's also floodwaters, there's carbon sequestration, there's nutrients, there's food change, there's biodiversity. And stakeholders' perceptions are very, very important, because it's what they see and how they get out of issues from a river that really matters. So it's what the current river is like and what it's doing for their particular area of issue. Is it providing the correct sort of fish for fishing? Is it providing the correct sort of water and the right amounts for irrigation? Or is it holding water up and holding carbon and making sure the peat's kept wet and therefore contributing to climate change? All of these things are actually important aspects. And not only do we have complexity, therefore, we've got connectivity and complexity working together, all these different aspects, okay? And the other real reason for actually talking with stakeholders is that stakeholders can do an awful lot for us as scientists and as project managers, because they've got a lot of assets, if you like, a lot of characteristics that are very valuable in its own right. First thing is that different stakeholders have very different knowledges of a river. They will know historically, or because they live there, or because they farm there, when it floods, where it floods, how the floods arise. They will have seen it with their own eyes instead of having to rely on high tech and monitoring systems. They've got a wealth of knowledge. They've got their own networks of communication, which operate far better than anything we could create. They talk to each other, they meet, they exchange information, they can mobilize support. They've got all these assets. Key to us is that stakeholders are potential partners in restoration. And as Hugh will show later on, without our landowners, our farmers, we couldn't do anything on the Eddleston Valley. This is an aerial photograph of some of the Eddleston Valley. They are absolutely key to us. They're partners in restoration. And the other key thing is that stakeholders are going to be the custodians. They're the legacy of anything we do. You do a project building with nature, it probably has a beginning and an end, but the folk who live there, the folk who farm there, they were there before we came, they're going to be there afterwards. So everything we do must fit in with their long-term aims. Okay? So that's the reasons. But so what's an ideal stakeholder engagement plan? Well, clearly you cannot talk to everybody. That would be absolutely impossible. So what you need is a representative sample of people, and those people should represent the sorts of issues, positive and negative, we deal with, different sets of locations. So maybe the top of the catchment, the bottom of the catchment. We quite like some of them to be old with long memories and have seen things, some of them to be really active at the moment. And as I said, some ideas of youth and the future. Somehow we've got to get to the people who don't talk or can't talk or don't have access. And we've got to obviously have communication both ways. It's not just from us as project managers building with nature, it's back. And above all, we need respect. We need to respect them, and hopefully they'll learn to trust us. Okay? So that's the sort of ideal plan. So what does that involve? Well, the key thing from a researcher or a project manager is probably listening and waiting. The timescales we set for doing things as researchers may not be, probably almost certainly aren't, the timetables and the priorities for people on the ground, the farmers and the different stakeholders. And we need to understand what their problems is and what they see as solutions rather than just what we see as them. So we may see a flooding problem, but that may be not what they see. They may have other views. Critically, we need to understand what success looks like for different stakeholders. For some people, success will just be staying the same. For some people, it will be stopping flooding. For other people, it may be increasing flooding because they're interested in wetland biodiversity. We need to be transparent. We need to tell them why we're doing things, what we're trying to do. We need critically to have the evidence and to be able to show what's happening. Very importantly, we need to report back to stakeholders continuously, not just once, not at the beginning and just at the end. And above all, we need a trust. We need them to trust us that we're really doing things out in the open and for their good and for our good and for the good of the environment, and vice versa. We need to trust them as well. Okay. So who's important and who's not? It's always an interesting question. And in this case, this is the position of where the Eddleston is. It's a small catchment there, about 70 square kilometres in the red box. You can see Edinburgh just to the north of that. And this is part of the Tweed catchment. The Tweed is a cross-border catchment. 16% of it is in England. The vast majority is in Scotland, though. And it's where Tweed Forum operate. And it's recognised actually by UNESCO as a hydrology, environment, life and policy basin. And that's actually because of the work of Tweed Forum through doing participatory catchment work, so working with people in the catchment to understand the issues there. So Eddleston Water is part of this whole Tweed Forum area. And as I said, it's the work package for Scottish case study, a river about 18 kilometres long. Okay. And the key way that we engage with stakeholders, and we're very lucky in this way, is we use Tweed Forum as a trusted intermediary. And as I said, it's a participative catchment NGO, non-government organisation. It's been working in the Tweed for nigh on 30 years. So it's very well recognised, even by UNESCO, as I said earlier on. And it sits in that centre ground between the state, whether that's the environment agencies or whether it's the nature conservation agencies or the government itself, and the individual landowners and land managers, as well as the academia and the press and other people. And critically for us, it's an organisation that understands the land managers and understands what the state is trying to do. And sitting there, they provide us the pathway to all these stakeholders, understanding where the knowledge sits, the resources, who might be new partners. Okay. And the Tweed Forum members provide us, if you like, the basis of answering that question of who's important. So there are government departments on the left-hand side, and everything's repeated because we have both England and Scotland in Tweed, though Eddleston itself is just in Scotland only. So we just deal with the Scottish ones. Having said that, we do get support from the English ones as well. There's the private voluntary sector, the conservation organisations, the fishing people, the agricultural people, the estates themselves, the anglers, the local authorities. Then come down the left-hand side, this is local government. And the actual organisation itself has independent trustees and its own permanent staff, of which Hugh is one, and I'm one of the independent trustees. Okay. And what we do is we use Tweed Forum to work out who are the most important stakeholders. And what we've got here is a graph that shows you on the left-hand side the interest going up the side from low interest in our particular issue. And the issue here we've mapped is flooding, and high at the top. And then on the bottom, running from the low influence to high influence. And the critical area here is to try and work out the most important stakeholders. And as you can see here, those with the highest influence and the highest interest are, not surprisingly, the landowners, the farmers, the foresters, and then the national politicians, the agencies, and the local authority. And we put all in green there. And down the left-hand end at the bottom, you've got other ones which have either less interest or less ability to influence, building with nature and the flooding issues. And then on top of all of this, you have the general public, and they range from having no interest at all to being very, very interested indeed. So you have all these people, and as I said, you can't speak to all of them, but you can work out which ones are important in your particular issue. And the way we've done this is to score them. We can score which ones are important on a very simple scale. And similarly, each of those organizations themselves can score themselves and score others. And you can get a very accurate matrix for any particular issue. And this is flooding, but were one to do biodiversity, it would be a different picture slightly. Okay. And what this then does is let you answer the next question, which is how, when, and what to communicate. Because what we'd like to ask each group is two things. What are their key concerns? And what's the best way we can talk with them and they can talk with us? So the colours here are in fact related to our communication strategy. So the green ones, which if you remember are the most important ones, they have the biggest influence. We actually talk face to face very regularly. So Hugh is the person who talks to all our landowners, to the farmers, to the foresters. I'm more likely to be talking to a politician or a local authority, certainly an academic. Other people in Tweed Forum, other people on the project will do that. But then as you drift down that, you've got the orange grouping where we won't talk to them day to day, we won't talk to them facely, but we'll send newsletters, targeted emails, and then right in the bottom left-hand corner, we have the general people who we will deal with general publications, things in the press, on the television. And at any one time, someone could slide up and down that arrow, I guess, and they could become more or less important. But at least this allows us to allocate our time, because obviously you have to work in the reality as opposed to the theory of stakeholder engagement. As I said at the beginning, you cannot talk to everybody on all issues, and neither would they want you to. So we have to have some means of doing it. And this is our communication strategy. Okay. So within that, what do we do? Well, I guess we go out and we talk to folks. So this is an example of going out and having a discussion group in one of the community halls. I think this was probably in Selkirk area, to capture local knowledge, to show them maps, to listen, to discuss, etc. And we've tended on the Eddleston to have two areas where we might meet, either in Eddleston itself, which is a very small village, or in the town of Peebles, which is at the bottom of the catchment where it joins the main stream. And those are the sorts of places we'd go back, okay? And if you go them, you can ask a range of issues. So one of the key things is we need to cover all the key issues. This is actually a map of the whole of the Tweed for a different piece of work we did. But what we did here was just to pick out some specific areas that between those 6 sites covered all the issues we were interested in. So you do some stratified sampling, if you like. You can't talk to everybody, but this makes sure we cover all the issues with biodiversity, with flooding, with diffuse pollution, with forestry, with agriculture, all these different issues. Okay. And then, as I said, we go out and we talk to the communities. This is one of Hugh's colleagues, Derek, working with me on this particular one. We've taken all these maps out of flooding and of ecosystem services. This was probably at Christmas, I suspect. I don't think they put the bunting up purely just for us in this particular case, but you never know. And we just record what the issues are. We're not critiquing, we're not telling them we're wrong, we're not taking any particular issues, and we can very easily record this. And I think the next slide shows you the sorts of things that might come out. So this is just a word diagram of, as you can see, the key issues, and forestry comes out here, very, very important in terms of flooding. But so you can see is localism, biodiversity, tourism, farming. These are the key issues that are there in the borders. And that wouldn't necessarily be true elsewhere, particularly in an urban area. One perhaps might get different issues coming out very, very differently. There's a very small one there about energy, but hydro schemes will no doubt be important elsewhere. Mining might be. So that's the sorts of issues that we can pick up on. And the other thing, of course, is we go out and we use the various places and means where people meet who might have an interest. And We tend to go to shows. So the right-hand top corner is actually, I think I'm right in saying, our local member of the Scottish Parliament talking to one of the researchers with a map below, and the public are sticking in labels as to where they think things flood, and then they're sticking in labels about what they think and where they think solutions might occur. And these solutions are just ones that they think of, they're not what we wish to them. On the bottom left-hand corner is a picture of Luke Cummins, who's the director of Tweed Forum, and two fantastic models we have of catchments. One, a very, very traditional, heavily farmed catchment, and the other one which has got a lot of building with nature aspects built into it, or built's the wrong word probably, but it's got meandering rivers, it's got lots and lots of wet bogs, it's got planting, it's got contour ploughing, it's got all these aspects that we would say would be very good. And we can actually use those, we can spray water onto those, and it collects and flows down and collects at the bottom. And it's a really good comparison to get people talking about the issues and the landscapes and the farming that goes on. And then Hugh and I also probably the two who give most talks to the local about issues like this. Others do, but I suspect between the two of us, we probably give the science and the reality. Okay, Hugh? And the sorts of things that we find there, which are very important to us, is how people see building with nature. So one has flood issues, and the farmers in particular are very, very keen to maintain active, profitable flooding, flood-free areas. So they would be interested in dredging. They're very keen to stop people building on the floodplain. If we do have the idea of building with nature and putting in these natural flood management methods, farmers are very, very keen to see that they're fairly compensated for any loss of production. And the whole point then comes out is that people are really beginning to see that they learn to live better with flooding on the grounds that in Scotland we're not going to stop it raining at any one time. And some of these methods put forward will have limited or sustainable impacts, but they all require assessment. Many of us would say that dredging a river is a very short-term, very localized solution that actually isn't a solution long-term, but other people may see it differently. Okay. So we have actually done, this is the last bits really from me, a little bit of work on understanding the stakeholder attitudes, because this is absolutely key. If we're going to try and persuade some of these stakeholders that building with nature, using natural flood management techniques are good and that they work, we need to understand how other people perceive it. So this is some work that Tweed Forum and myself and Heriot-Watt University as well did, talking with a whole series of farmers, including a whole series from the Eddleston elsewhere, about their attitudes. And just to give you two slides of the sorts of information we might collect. This first one then, Hugh, is an example of what would be acceptable to farmers in terms of building with nature. And there are 4 different types here, and the graphs on each go from number 1 on the left, which is they would not consider this at all on their farms, to the right hand side, number 5 being, yep, they'd be quite interested and up for this as a possibility, and then there's a no answer. And what you learn very quickly there is that if one was to talk to farmers about blocking the tile drains, the under soil drainage systems, this would absolutely be unacceptable. And similarly, very unkeen to reduce stock density by the cows or sheep. But if you talk about planting large areas of trees, you see a very different response, particularly along watercourses. So we can see where Hugh can talk to farmers about what they might be interested in doing without completely going against their own interests and their business interests and their feelings. And then another example is how best to provide information to farmers. And what's interesting here is that in the left-hand side top, it says how to provide information. And again, the biggest score there is face-to-face on my farm. That's the one with 32. But there are also modern farms looking about availability online. So a number of different ways. What is also interesting is who should provide the information. And what's there is that they would actually like virtually all of us to be able to provide the information. It doesn't matter whether it's the Scottish Government, the Environment Protection Agency, the National Farmers Union, local authorities, or farm advisors. Actually having any and all people being able to provide that information. And then if you ask them about who should support and promote it, perhaps not surprisingly, farmers say, well, it should be the government or it should be the Environmental Protection Agency who are going to be the most important in terms of doing this and promoting it. But there is a role for organisations like Tweed Forum and local authorities, local government, to help with supporting and promoting it. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Hugh. That, as I said, is the theory of why we might talk, the ideal, the reality, how we define it, and where and what we learn from communication. And Hugh can now take you through the realities of what actually happens on the ground. Thanks, Hugh.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. That was great. So I'm just going to talk about actually working with land managers and the lessons we've taken from Eddleston. And a lot of them, it does definitely fits the theory that Chris has laid out here. So the first thing we had to do is work out what our project aims were. And, the project came in before Building with Nature, but we are definitely a Building with Nature type project. And so we have two aims. The first is to restore the river and its catchment. The river had been damaged over the last few hundred years by straightening for industry and for roads and largely for railway. So we want to restore the features back to the river. And one of the features of the river being damaged was it actually increased flooding downstream at a small village of Eddleston and the town of Peebles. So we want to look at how we can restore the river and its catchment while promoting the livelihoods of those deriving income. And farming is very much the main land use there. And we want to measure everything. So that's where the scientists come in. We want to measure these effects. And we're looking at natural flood management to reduce flooding and see what it does. We're creating ponds and wetlands. And the first diagram on the left there was the initial land use survey that was done by Dundee University, looking at where there may be opportunities for natural flood management measures. So in those measures, I was saying is creating ponds with extra flood water storage, large weedy debris in streams. That's to allow the river to reconnect with its with the floodplain, and perhaps looking at reduced stocking density of animals and floodplain forests, remeandering channels, and that's the exciting bit. So yeah, so that's what we first did, and as I say, Chris is measuring everything. Okay. So some examples. So we've zoomed in a bit to what's happening in the real world. The first map in the last slide was from 2010. We're now up to 2019, 2020. So if you can see here, I've been out speaking to farmers and getting to know them. And in the catchment, I think we have about 19 owner-occupiers in the 70 square kilometre catchment. And we have one large, what we call an estate, where the landowner lives remotely and the farm is managed by managers. We also have a big chunk of land which is owned by the Scottish Government, and it's under forestry, conifer forestry. So the first thing we managed to do with this farmer right at the top of the catchment, where it flattens out, and remember we're going in cold, really. We have to explain to the farmer exactly what we're doing and what we think, well, what we'd like to do, what the aims are, and ask them basically how they can help us. I think that's the most important thing, is to say how we can get enlist their help. So you'll see here, I'm not sure if you can see my arrow or not, but we can see where we can fence off headwater streams. And again, this has good effects for all kinds of things, for diffuse pollution. Some of them we fence off because the streams are actually dangerous to livestock, and so the farmers actually lose less livestock from drowning. We've taken an agricultural ditch and found some room to create a sinuous shape, and this is quite a modest affair, not proper remeandering, I would say, but just a way of creating diversity in a stream. Filled in an artificial water course where we would normally it was basically a basin mire to begin with. We're looking at something called a stage 0 water course to try and restore the land. It might just flush over a bog in the natural run of things. And again, constructing floodwater storage ponds. And now these can look like just the things we call SUDs, sustainable urban drainage schemes, in new housing developments, and they can be dry, but we prefer to keep them wet all the time because we then get the wildlife and biodiversity benefits. So we created a lot of ponds, but they have extra freeboard. So when the floodwater does come, it fills that up before running on. Okay, I'll go down a bit. And these are, this shows you what it looks like. So as you can see, we're not on the most fertile land, and the farmer would not entertain that. So in as polite a way as possible. So you can see we've straightened the ditch. Taken a straightened ditch and given it some sinuosity. Put in flood storage ponds, and this is the mire here. Further down, we talked about the suitability, and the farmers thought it'd be quite good to plant trees beside the streams. That's the riparian zones, and we've managed to do a lot of that in this area over here at Shiplaw, it's called, and these streams here. But we've also came across a farmer in the higher part of the catchment. He enabled us to basically plant a lot of trees. We're talking 100 hectares of trees, and plant construct some substantial ponds. And you can see that these ponds here are going to hold quite a bit of water, and it hopefully is significant in the catchment. Now, the other thing, which we think is probably one of the most successful features in terms of natural flood management measures, are these highlighted in purple here. These are high flow log restrictors. So what we've got is a feature here made of, it could just be any brush, any branches from trees that have fallen over, but they're actually holding water in the side of the water course. They're causing the water to spill out over the sides. And we did show someone's MSc project that this will actually slow down the water, the high peak of this flow, by about 70 minutes. And this is what natural flood management is about. It's about holding water in the landscape for longer than it has been held at the moment. And this is what we can explain to farmers, that we just want to use your land in a temporary basis. We don't necessarily want to use it all the time. So that's another option. So we come further downstream to the kind of main channel of the river. You'll see in this centre photograph here where we've taken a very straight water course. I think we've taken about 2 kilometres in this section and turned it into almost 2.5 kilometres of river. Now that has massive amounts of benefits, and you saw earlier a photograph where this river was reconnected to its floodplain, so it does flood in times of high flow. So water is held there on a temporary basis, and we've managed to design it with the permission of the farmers so that the greenest fields here don't flood. These are the ones that produce the beef and the sheep and the wool that the farmer can sell. This is the grass to make silage, and it's the most fertile bit of the catchment and is very important. So we have to avoid these. But in this case, we've been able to do it. We've taken out a commercial woodland, we've replaced it. The farmer is very happy for us to do that. And we've created an amazing native woodland habitat, as well as a much improved habitat in the river itself. So the river is bigger, it's better, and it's better in ways that we're hoping to be able to measure, especially in terms of numbers of fish, because we have Atlantic salmon coming all the way up here. They lay their eggs here in the clean gravels, and this is basically the source of the income for about a £20 million income on the Tweed for Atlantic salmon. So it's a big cultural affair, and it's very important in the Tweed. So there's examples. And getting further down to Peebles, this is a large flood pond area which floods and holds a lot of water. So we're talking about almost getting to the level of needing a reservoir license. We've stayed under that because we don't want to produce a reservoir that needs to be inspected every year. But we're maybe holding up nearly 10,000 cubic metres of water in this instance. And this is through a partnership with a landowner and, in fact, a company or a government body that wanted to create some a cycle route access. And you can see that the side there where the cycle route will go. They bought the land, took the way leave for the cycle route, and then sold the land to the other farmer, or the landowner who was keen in nature. So he's created a wonderful little nature reserve there at Kidston Mill. So yeah, so that's what we've managed to do. And how have we managed? I mean, I came from a background of natural tree planting and working with farmers. And my own background is as a farmer's son. So that's one of the things we find is that there are barriers to engagement, but one of the things we need is someone with a personable messenger, and I come under that category, I think, not too objectionable, and I do have some farming knowledge, but not that I would ever go in and tell the farmer what to do. That's one thing you don't do. But it's good to ask and say, you know, why are your cows that colour? You know, why, you know, that kind of thing. So we're looking at the barriers to engagement. Back to the script, really. Yeah, and as Chris said before, some of them have entrenched views on drainage and dredging. We often hear about dredging, and the farmers, you know, their grandfathers always used to remove gravel from the river, and that would help the water get away more quickly. And there's not a lot we can say about that other than that would be breaking the law now, and if they care to go to prison, well, that might be the only way to get the dredging done. So they have entrenched views, so we have to really bring them round to that. The other thing they do, of course, is water their livestock in the river, and this leads to diffuse pollution. And again, that is changing due to various EU and government directives. So yeah, so the farmers don't want to lose income. That's fair enough. None of us would want to do that. They don't want to lose capital value. They don't want to make a mess. They don't want to lose control. And this is where, you know, we work out exactly what we can do. And I was intrigued by an interview from someone talking about the uptake of natural flood management measures in the southwest of England. Up in the top right there, you can see a statement from the farmer. We were won over by the empathetic Rivers Trust approach. That's good. We're all for empathy, which seduced us into taking some modest first steps. And I thought that's interesting. I haven't been asked to go that far yet, but there we go, seducing us to taking some modest first steps. And the staff were from local farming families and respected our position, and they learned to enjoy NFM work. So that's great. I think we've really engaged with farmers there and come to a new way of land management, because I think that's what we do need, is an entirely new way of managing land. It's interesting too that the farmers I deal with, and even in Eddleston, there is quite a bit of flux and change over the 10 years you've been working. You know, some farmers have died and their sons or daughters have taken over, others have moved on, farms have been sold. So there's always a chance in time. It all takes time to go in and chat to people and see if they're interested in changing things. And of course, one of the best ways of someone changing their mind is to look over the fence and say, well, that's worked. You've not made too much of a mess, and perhaps I will come and join and do the things that we want to do. And that's where we can target the local ambassadors, and we have some kind of quiet champions, I would say, in the Eddleston catchment. They're not too loud about it, but they've let us do what we want to do, and they can see that it's worked. Now this is where we talk money, and then when I'm talking about to farmers about money, I obviously got to show them that they won't cost them any money, in fact gain some income. So there are ways of doing that, and generally I would fill in application forms if they're planting trees through the national scheme, which is called the Forestry Grant Scheme. The paperwork can be onerous. Farmers have got enough on their plates with animal passports and all kinds of regulations. And if need be, we'll manage the delivery of the works. And that takes time. it takes money, it takes time to pay for someone like myself to do that. So that's where Tweed Forum comes in. And finally, feedback. Chris, I think you're going to go back to talk over this one, so I think I'll stop talking and hand over to you. Can you do that?
Yep, absolutely. Just a very final one then. As I said earlier on, it is vitally important to give feedback in a positive way to all those that are engaged. And as I said earlier on, use the desired methods. It may well be talking to them individually. And we've discovered more and more it's very important that language is chosen. So it's no good talking to people in scientific, technical terms if that's not appropriate. We need to be very clear about what we mean if we say something floods 1 in every 100 years, particularly if it's flooded in the last 2. Probabilities are always difficult. And we need to be very careful we explain what we're trying to restore things to. We're not trying to produce a wild scape, a wild wetland here, unmanaged. On the contrary, we need it managed. It's just managed in a different way. And as Hugh's just said, we don't avoid the hard questions. If you are planting forests, you're obviously not producing food. If you're flooding land, you're obviously having an impact, and we must be very obvious. And quite clearly, we have to be honest about the uncertainties. We don't know quite whether all these measures will work. That's why we're doing the research as we go along. We don't know what climate change will do, so that's why we're doing the work. But it's very important then not to wait to the end, but to report back on each phase, things that work and equally things that don't. As Hugh said, if people see things working, that's great. And that's probably the last thing, other than this very clear point at the end, that if you actually don't do things after all engagement and talking to people, i.e. you don't follow up, you don't report back, you actually build up the opposite of what you want, which is resentment and a lack of trust, and people won't talk to you next time. So even if there's nothing to say, we need to go out and say it to folk and meet them and listen to them as we go on. So I think that's probably all from us, and that just leaves you with a huge load of thanks and some details as to where to find more information. Thanks.